Jeff, and thanks to everyone for coming to the session today. And yeah, like Jeff said, I'm going to be talking about records management. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the basics of records management, but I do plan on focusing on some of the more advanced things that you might not be aware of that you can do. And before we get started here, one thing I would like to do is make sure that I thank the sponsors. It's a huge part of why we were able to do this is having those sponsors, be there, be part of this, part of the conference, and to provide us with a method of presenting these topics to you. Just a little bit about myself. My name is David Drever. I'm a senior manager and enterprise architect with Protiviti. And I'm a 5 times now Office Apps and Services MVP. So if you have any questions at any point or you want to reach out, my email address is there, david.drever@protiviti.com. I tweet at davidmdrever, and I blog at prairiedeveloper.com. So there's a few things I want to cover today. The first one being just some retention basics. I'll talk a little bit about dispositions. We're going to talk about records in Microsoft 365, and the reason I want to talk about records is that they are a little bit different, or they're a little bit different than a regular retention label. And of course, we're going to talk about applying labels to content, and then we're going to talk about event-based retention. So let's start a little bit with the basics of records management in Microsoft 365. The biggest thing here is to think about with records management is that it's an in-place system. And what that means is if you're used to physical records, managing your content with physical records, usually you had different places of storage depending on the state of that content. Whether it was an archive, whether it was active, they had different places to go. You don't have that with Microsoft 365. From the point it's made active to the point it moves into archival, it's kept in the same location. And the benefit to that is that you always know where to go find it. You have disposition controls, and some of it is automated. So you can control, when content should be removed based on your labels. You can review it. You have all those controls available to you. And the other thing too is think about is that information management in Microsoft 365 is more than just controlling the retention of your content. It also deals with the sensitivity of the content as well. Is it highly sensitive content? Is it not? Is it maybe open to the public? Things like this can also control how you retain your content. So these are things you can go beyond than just managing the retention of your content. Now Microsoft is doing a really good job, in my opinion, of trying to balance this whole experience. Records management can be very complex because they need to know all of the different rules for maintaining the content. The more retention schedules you have in your environment, the more complex it can be. And something to think about here, like I work with organizations that have tens of thousands of record schedules in some cases, and that becomes a problem because there's so many options available to users and they don't really know what to use, and things often will get mislabeled. So Microsoft is trying to help with that by providing automating of your labeling, applying it based on content, applying it based on location, things like that. So they're trying to give the record managers their ability to control the content, but at the same time trying to balance that with a great user experience. Now, dealing with labels in Microsoft 365, a couple things I want to talk about here. When you're dealing with retention, your most common method of doing that in Microsoft 365 is a retention label. And when you get down to it, a retention label is just a piece of metadata in your environment, on your content, but what happens in the back end is where the magic happens. And so that retention label is, like I said, it's just metadata, but in the back end is where it defines when this label is existing, how long does this content need to be maintained? Can they delete it? Does it have to be, can it be allowed, can modifications be made to the content? These are all things that need to be considered. You also have the ability to apply labels automatically based on metadata, based on kind of maybe if it's a particular sensitivity type. You can even train the environment to know what kind of data it is based on the form that's used. So if you have invoices, I'm sure that Jeff talked about this in his Cortex. You can actually train the environment to say, hey, this is an invoice. This particular type of invoice happens to be a invoice account as an approval invoice, and so I'll label it accordingly for you. So these are things that you can do automatically. Now, unfortunately, if you don't have E3 licenses, or if you're not using the advanced compliance SKU in your tenant, you can't do automatic retention of your content. But just to know that it's there might be something to consider about getting a different license scheme. Now, one thing I want to make sure you don't confuse retention labels with, because Microsoft is really good at separating out different terminologies, there's also sensitivity labels. So sensitivity labels are very similar to retention label in the fact that it's still a piece of metadata, but it's not actually metadata at the location that it's stored at. So in your SharePoint site or in your Teams or something like that, it's actually applied to the document itself. And the reason for this is that sensitivity label's purpose is to actually determine or to define how sensitive is your content. Is it restricted? Is it internal only? Is it public? And along with that, you can actually use your sensitivity label to modify the content. So it'll put in headers and footers for you. It'll apply watermarks. It'll even encrypt the data. So these are things to make sure when you're talking about labels in compliance, there is a difference between sensitivity and retention labels, and just to make sure you're aware of that. Now, along with the labels are great. They just sit in the tenant, but the problem with the labels, it just sits there. You actually need what's called a policy or a retention label policy to push that data from the wherever, like from the tenant to the different locations they're required in. Now, what is fantastic about this is gone are the days where if you have 500 labels, you have to choose from 500 labels. If your site only requires HR-specific labels or IT-specific labels, you only have to have those available to you in that SharePoint site. So a retention label policy is what does that for you. So the policy will define what labels am I including in this policy, and where do they have to exist? Do they have to exist in somebody's OneDrive account? Do they have to exist in SharePoint? Do they have to exist in a group? If they exist in a group, that makes them available to a team. So all of these components are actually pushed out from retention label. Microsoft says it takes about 24 hours to make them available. I'm finding it's more like an hour these days. And the auto applying labels do take a little bit longer, but I don't think it's quite 7 days yet for those either. So these are things to consider. Like, you can create all the labels you want, but without a policy, they're not going to get pushed out. Now, a retention policy, just to throw some more confusion into the mix, is different. So we talked about retention label policy. Now I'm going to talk about a retention policy. So I call the retention policy the big blunt hammer, because it's considered basically it's a blanket approach. So you can apply a retention policy to an entire site, and what happens is that you can automatically assign all content to the retention policy, and if it doesn't have a label assigned to it, the retention policy will be a fallback. So usually a rule of thumb is with a retention policy is, let's say for instance, I'm pushing a series of labels out to a site, and the longest retention period of all those labels is 10 years. So what I want to do to make sure that it's going to catch all of that data, whether it gets labeled or not, is I'll create a retention policy that will retain the data for 10 years, so that if my users forget to label the policy, or I don't have a rule that catches some particular information, that backup retention policy is there, and it'll remove the data as required after those 10 years. Now, a couple of downsides to this is that there's no user interaction, so I can't say, yes, apply the policy, don't apply the policy. If I don't apply a label, the policy is going to take over. There's also no disposition control. So if I set a 10-year retention and I set to delete data, I cannot determine, or I can't do a disposition review on that content. Disposition reviews exist on labels. They do not exist on retention policies. So that's something to consider. If a cont document is maintained by a retention label in SharePoint and you try to delete that label, it'll block the deletion. A retention policy, however, if it's being applied to a retention it's being protected by a retention policy, you will be able to delete the data, but then it goes into a hidden preservation hold library and is maintained for the duration of the retention of that document. So Jeff, I just want to pause for a second. Is there any questions showing up yet about anything I've talked about? Okay, I'll keep going.
Sorry, just came off mute. Nothing yet, sir.
Okay, perfect. No, I'll keep going then.
And so again, to the group that's out there, sorry, Dave. Yeah. If there are any questions, just pop them in the chat window, and I am moderating. Please feel free, ask away. Back to you.
All right, thanks, Jeff. So when we're dealing with policies are they have certain rules around them. And these are label policies I'm talking about here. It's not the retention policy. So a label policy is applied at the site collection level. I can't go to a particular library. I can't go to a particular subsite if you're using subsites. It has to be done at a site collection level. So it makes it available to all libraries within and any subsites below. I can select particular subsites, or sorry, particular site collection. So again, going back to an HR example, if HR has a number of sites that they utilize, both communication sites, team sites, and they all have to have the same labels assigned to them, I can select multiple sites in my policy. I can also just say one site, or I can say all of the sites. Now, when you're selecting particular sites, if a new site comes online that needs to have the labels assigned to it, you either have to update the policy and add that new site to it, or you have to create a new policy and make sure it gets pushed out. If you select for a label or for a policy that it goes to all locations, it'll automatically push those labels out to the new site when the site comes online. So something to be aware of. If you're limiting or you're controlling the sites that a retention label is being pushed out to, you need to make sure that you update that list when you are creating new sites. OneDrive is similar. It's in this case, it's applied to the user, sort of. When you push the site, it's actually going to a person's site collection, because again, everyone knows OneDrive is run by SharePoint in the back end. So again, it's a site collection. So it's going to the user's site collection. Same thing applies here. If I'm dealing with particular sites, I want this only available to like the HR users, I would have to maybe utilize a group. And I would actually suggest maybe utilizing a mail-enabled group in this instance. And the reason for that is that as you add and remove users from that group, it's going to get populated, and then the label will be updated without you actually having to update the label or the policy itself. So when dealing with OneDrive policies, I strongly suggest you use a mail-enabled group, so that way you can actually update it without having to touch the policy itself. Now, Exchange is a little bit different than the others because it's an Exchange mailbox as opposed to a SharePoint site. The big thing here is that, again, when you want to push it out to certain users, keep in mind that maybe using a mail-enabled group here as well is beneficial, because again, you can control it that way. Now, a Microsoft 365 group is a mixture of Exchange rules and SharePoint rules, and that's simply because you have both in a Microsoft 365 group. A group is a mixture of SharePoint sites and Exchange mailboxes. I know there's more to it, but that's the gist of it in this situation. So then, it'll apply labels. Any labels that are applied will be applied during in-flight as you send messages out or as they come in. It can be applied to the site itself, and it can be applied to attach the mailbox in the sites as well. You can search for data based on sensitivity. So if I upload a document that contains credit cards, I can look for that and say, okay, this is a payment document, or this is a highly sensitive content, and I can label it based on that, applying the retention for those particular types of content. So all of that is available to you in a Microsoft 365 group. Some other rules to think about when you're dealing with retention of documents is a label or a records policy, a retention policy is required for any finalization of your content. And what I mean by finalization, think of a document as having a life cycle. Document gets created for a purpose, it gets updated, it gets consumed, it gets updated again, some more consumption, then it goes into archival, and finally, after the archive is over, it gets removed. So that's your life cycle of a document, and the finalization is usually the removal or the in some organizations, especially government organizations, they have a forever archive, and so there's that consideration as well. Now, there's two types of label categories: explicit and implicit. Now, if you look at it from this perspective, an explicit label is anything that I have set myself manually. Anything that is set automatically is implicit. However, there is a caveat to that. When I say it's set automatically, I'm talking about based on the parent of the document. So if a folder has a default label, I'm inheriting that label, that's implicit. If, however, I have a workflow that using the REST APIs is actually assigning a label through a flow, I'm actually creating that even though it's an automated process, it's explicit label because I've actually manually set it through the API. So that's something to be aware of. When I talk about automatic labeling, I'm talking about labeling that's being done by the label policy itself, or by where the document is located, because it's being inherited by the parent. Where this becomes important is actually what's called the order of precedence. Now, the order of precedence is there when you're dealing with content that could possibly have more than one label applied to it at once. So one of the things I haven't really talked about yet is that when I'm talking about a retention policy, 9 times out of 10, your retention policy is there to make sure that the content is maintained for a certain amount of time. There's also a deletion policy or deletion label. And what the deletion label does is it's basically saying is after so many years or so many months, make sure this content is removed. So instead of making sure it's retained, it's actually making sure it's being removed. If it gets deleted before that time, it's not a problem. But as far as the label is concerned, but the label is just there to make sure that the content is removed after a certain amount of time. So when it comes to the order of precedence, if I have 2 labels can be applied to content based on whatever business logic around that is, maybe it's a particular site column, the retention label is always going to win over a deletion label because they want to make sure the content is retained. If both labels are retention labels, the label with the longest retention is going to win. Then if 2 labels are they're both retention labels, they both have they both have the same retention time on it. At that point, I believe it is just the first label that comes up in the check that will be applied at that point, because from the system perspective, they both have the same retention level, so that it doesn't matter which one gets applied. So those are something to be aware of. An explicit label, however, always wins over an implicit inclusion. So what that means is that if I explicitly set a label on a document, an implicit label or an automatic label cannot overwrite that. However, if an implicit label already exists on a document, maybe because it's been inherited from the parent folder, I can change that manually by just changing the record or the document label. And all I need to do that is contribute access. I need to have edit access to the content in order to make that change. Now, the last level of the order of precedence is that if you're dealing with 2 deletion based retention labels, the shortest period wins. So if I have one that's going to get delete content after 3 years, another one's going to delete content after 5 years, the 3-year will win. All right, any questions about the order of precedence at all? All right. So let's talk about disposition reviews. So really, what a disposition review is just allows data owners and record managers to make sure that data that is being flagged for removal is actually ready to be removed. And why would you want to do this? Well, there are times it happens is that your labels are incorrectly labeled. Their documents are incorrectly labeled. So you want to make sure that you check that to make sure, okay, this actually isn't an employee document. This is actually a benefits document. It was mislabeled, so it has a different retention time on it. Maybe the label that it was labeled under isn't viable anymore. Oh, sorry.
Dave, I've got a couple of questions real quick. Sorry to interrupt.
No, of course.
The keyword-based auto apply label, if we change the value of the metadata associated with the document, does the applied label, will it be reversed?
No.
Yes.
So unfortunately, changing of the label will not remove a auto applied label. And this actually that's actually a good question, Jeff, because it brings up another point that if I happen to have a document that was labeled based on an auto apply rule and another one comes along that is actually more important, there's no way of saying it's more important. So if another label is created that has an auto apply rule applied to it and it hits the document that's already been labeled, that document will not have its label changed.
Great. I think that sort of answers the next question. How does moving docs between libraries affect the retention labels?
So moving documents between retention labels is if the document is moved to another library that has the same label available to it, the label is maintained. If I move it to a different location entirely that does not have that same label available to it, the label is removed. The label has to exist because the label is actually based on the location of the content and not the content itself. So if the label doesn't exist in the new place I move it to, it will not be available on the document any further.
Perfect. Thanks, buddy. Back to you.
All right, thanks. So when we're dealing with disposition reviews, a disposition review is actually defined with the label. And you can add the viewers or the reviewers individually to the label itself. Again, going back to modifying a label every time you want to change users, I strongly suggest you actually use like a mail-enabled security group. So if it's HR, if you have a large enough organization that things are split out based on department or something like that, you can have a mail-enabled group for HR documents or HR disposition reviews. And that way you can change it without having to affect the label of the policy itself at any point in time. Disposition reviews usually happen, the notice usually happens once a week when new content is marked for disposition. You'll see here that the email that you receive doesn't actually contain the documents that, like a list of documents, because it could be 100 documents at a time. Now, the other thing, too, is that when a document is disposed, it doesn't leave immediately. The job that picks up an approved disposed document, it doesn't happen immediately. I think the job runs 2 or 3 times a week. And what happens is it moves it into the recycle bin. And this is the site collection recycle bin. So it's maintained there for 93 days unless the disposition is backed out. So you still have time to back out the disposition. And that 93 days can change as well because it's in the secondary recycle bin. That's based on space. So if you have a huge influx of content that is removed from the site collection, your 93 days could get changed simply because other stuff came into the secondary recycle bin and pushed out your retained document. So that's something to be aware of. Once the document has been disposed completely from the environment, you have 14 days to contact Microsoft to have that restored, after which it is gone forever. Emails, on the other hand, you have 14 days after it's been approved for disposition to have them removed. And everything that you do when you're records manager, you can dispose, you can extend retention, and you can relabel. Any of those options that you select, those options are completely audited in the environment, and then they'll be maintained in your audit logs. And if you have a management system attached like Azure Sentinel, you can have them for as long as you require them to be there. And the actual destruction of the content is also logged, so that can be used as a certificate of destruction if your environment requires it. With records are a little bit different than retention in the sense that with a record, it does have a retention applied to it, but when it's declared as a record, which is a toggle on your system, content can't be permanently deleted, it can't be modified, changed, or removed. And in fact, the label can only be changed by site collection administrator. So think of it as actually locking down the content. Now, the other piece around here, so if I try to delete content or move content, it'll block it in SharePoint. In Exchange, it'll actually move it to a recoverable items folder for as long as the content is retained. And in OneDrive, it'll move it to a preservation hold library. Now, one of the things that's very important to note, and this is something that has changed very recently, I think like in the last 2 weeks, I think the change happened on January 8th. Content in the preservation hold library was not counted against your overall storage in your tenant. That has changed. So if you're using retention labels or retention policies to maintain data and for a certain amount of time, as a place that is no longer, you don't have to worry about storage, that is not the case anymore. Your recoverable items folder, your preservation hold library is now counted against your overall tenant storage. When you're dealing with records, you have this new concept that came out last year called record versioning. So what that does is, as a user with contribute access to the library, I can actually unlock a record document, make my changes, and lock it up again. And what that does is that allows me to apply retention at the version 1, so to speak, and then I make some changes, and at version 10, I need to, this is now, we're finalizing this document again, so I need to actually apply retention to version 10 as well. So when I lock the document again, version 10, I have now created a retention, a record retention a period for both version 1 and version 10. So let's say I make version 1 in 2001, and in 2002 I made version 2. I know I'm going way back in time, but let's just say how long ago. Let's change it again. 2020. That's what it should have said. In 2020 I made version 1, and in 2021 I made version 10. So what happens is if it had a 5-year retention, version 1 will be removed in 2025. But version 10, which was created in 2021, will be maintained until 2026. So those retention labels are based on when it was locked again. I'm just going to keep going here, so I know I'm running out of time, so you can see the bigger picture of that. Now, auto-assigning labels, you do have that ability, and this is actually based on both. It can be based on the sensitivity content. It can be based on, is it a financial document? Is it a personal information document? But you can also base it on particular keywords as well. So let's say, for instance, I'm looking for anything that had a content type of accounts payable and Protiviti in the document has a particular, it's an invoice for Protiviti, and based on whatever rules internally, it has to be maintained for 5 years. So that auto apply label will actually look for any content with that particular content type of accounts payable, Protiviti, and apply the label to it. Similarly, and this one's kind of neat actually, is that, say for instance, I'm looking for documents that, I'm working for the city, we're maintaining our trains, and I'm looking for a train maintenance document. So I can have documents, some documents get long, I can have both train and maintenance in it, but it may not be a train maintenance document. But if I actually happen to say, like in my example here, I have train near n equals 7 maintenance, what I'm saying here is that if train and maintenance are within 7 words of each other, that's probably a train maintenance document, so I can label it as accordingly. So that near keyword is actually used to make sure that like 2 or more words are actually near each other in order to help determine if that is the type of document I'm looking for. Event-based retention. So event-based retention is exactly what it sounds like. Other types of retention in your environment are based on when the document was created, when the document was last changed, when you applied the label, or on an event. So let's say, for instance, a contract. You have a contract with a vendor, and that contract has expired. That's an event. You can have one where an employee leaves the company. That's also an event. Fiscal year end. These are all events. These are all things that aren't based on a date. They're based on something happening. So that's what an event-based retention is. With event-based retention, you have an event type, and whether it's employee offboarding or vendor contract expiration, project closure. These are all event types. And you have the event label, and the reason you have the event type is you can have multiple labels attached to an event type, so that when you fire off the event, I say I want to fire off a project closure event, and it's going to go and get all of the different labels that are attributed to my event and fire off the retention schedule for it. So let's take a look at this. I have a project lifecycle, and my event type is project lifecycle, and within it I have 3 labels. I have project requirements, project designs, and project change requests. And across multiple libraries, I have all these different documents for different projects. Now, when you're dealing with events, not only do you have to have the label, but you have to have some key metadata assigned to it to help you identify it. In this case, I just have an asset, and my asset is project one, is the project number. So let's say, for instance, that project 123 completes. So what I want to do is I want to fire off an event that highlights that, says, okay, project 123 is deleted, or is over, project 123 is over, and I need to maintain that content for 5 years. So what I need to do then is I fire off the event for project 123. I give it the asset of 123, project 123, and what that does for me is it will then go through the entire environment and look for any label that or any document that has project requirements, project designs, or project change requests, and then it's going to grab whatever. As soon as I find the project 123, it's going to grab that and it's going to start kicking off the retention policy for it. It's not going to touch ABC. It's not going to touch XYZ. It's only going to worry about 1, 2, 3. So that's what the event does. Now, the problem with this is that in order to do this, it can actually put a lot heavy load on your records management team. So there's also the ability you can now, with your E5 license, is actually automate this. And I'm going to demonstrate this here really quick. So what this allows you to do then is to allow the staff that is in charge of those events to actually kick off the events without having to go into your console, your admin console, because to do that you need to have highly elevated access, and we don't want to give that to everyone in the environment. So what I want to do here is I'm going to actually kick off a flow, and this can be based off of any tool. So let's say, for instance, I'm going to do it on a let's do it with an employee document. So I have an example here. So I have employee-based retention. So my records management team, they build out the labels, they build out the policies, and it's pushed out to the HR's employee site. Employee gets hired. HR team is now dealing with all this. They have all the documentation. It's maintained. It's labeled. In order to maintain this, the content retention periods, I don't want to have my records manager to always kick off events for different employees, because it can take time. And we have 100,000 employees for some of these big corporations. That can be happening all the time. They just can't keep up. So let's say, for instance, we're using Workday. Well, Workday has a connector in Power Automate that when an employee gets terminated, it kicks off a flow. So I can actually use this concept to run this for me. So I'm going to show really quick. It'll take me a couple more minutes, and then we can pause for some questions.
Perfect.
Let me just get to my screen here. So we'll see here I have a SharePoint site, and I have a bunch of employee documents here. Now, I don't have a Workday connector, so I can't actually show that. But let's say, for instance, here, Grace Hunter's left the company. So to offboard, I'm just going to I create a Power App that's going to simulate the automation of this. So Grace Hunter has her employee ID is 642187. I just need to make sure I have got the latest version of this. All right, come on. All right, so 642187. And she actually left the company back on the 18th. It just took us this long to get to it. So I'm going to offboard her, and we'll see if this is going to work for me here. I tried this yesterday, and I thought I made the update, but it didn't. I don't think it took. All right. No, it didn't. All right, let's do this here. We're going to do it here. Sorry. Seriously. All right. What did I say her number was? Her number was 642187. Okay, so if I go and take a look at it here, if I do a refresh, we should see that it has not that I want. So I'm going to make this manual, guys. My apologies, because we know we're running out of time. So I'm going to say here, this is what the Power App is supposed to do for me. It's going to say that she's offboarded, and the offboard date we'll just say is today. All right. So what's going to happen now is I've got this flow. So while I'm waiting for the flow to kick off, let's see if it's going to running yet. No, it hasn't run yet. This is an old one. So I'm going to show you what this flow does for me while I'm waiting for it to kick off. And all it does here really quick is it checks to see when a file has been modified. It pauses to make sure everything's been set. It checks to make sure it's an employee document and that the is employee offboard is set to true. Then it's going to fall in here and it's going to check to make sure that the employee offboard date is not empty. And here's the key thing here. I'm actually firing off a call to the tenant, and this is the address here. I'm passing in this information. Here's what I'm looking for right now. I'm saying this is when I've set it. I'm setting it to now. I'm going to set the employee offboarding ID and the employee ID, and I'm saying that the compliance asset ID is the same one because that's what I've selected as my defining information. And all it does then is it fires off this call to the tenant, and then the tenant picks it up and it kicks off the event for me. So let's see if it's run. So we can see it ran about a minute ago. So now if I go to my records records management system here, I'll refresh. And what we should see here, we see I have 2 right now. And if I refresh, there is 642187, which I believe was Grace. And it just fired here just a minute ago. So without having to actually do it from records management perspective, I actually kicked off the entire event from an environment that only the HR team would have access to. So that, in a nutshell, everyone, is kind of how records retention can work, and when you get to more advanced stuff, how you can apply some of the advanced concepts. So I'd like to pause and find out if anyone has any questions about anything that we talked about today.
Nothing yet. Feel free, just jump. You guys can't come off mute, but put your question in the chat.
Yep.
Very helpful information. Craig is in the house. What's up, Craig? Snowy Chicago. Anybody?
Okay, I can stay online for another 5 minutes or so here. Then, Jeff, if anybody has any questions, but I'd like to thank everyone for coming out, and a huge thank you to the team here at the Microsoft 365 Friday for California. It was a lot of fun.